for all verified facts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome. My guest for today has said that in thinking about the future, we must keep India's historical economic context in mind. Except for a gap of about 200 years, India has been a large contributor to global output. As recently as 1820, India contributed 16% of global GDP. China was, of course, around 33%, but between the two, they controlled almost half of world global GDP or global output. Now, let's cut to 2020 and the Prime Minister Modi's speech on Independence Day. He talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliant India, of course. He also talked about vocal for local and how we should use our resources to make in India, but more importantly, make for the world. Now, making for the world is something which would mean that we are more export-oriented. We are maybe do away with some of the import substitution themes that we've been talking about or tend to gravitate to in the past. So how do we do that? And what could be the path in forward? And how do we explain to someone who doesn't understand whether can India become a global export powerhouse if it has to achieve some of its larger economic objectives. To discuss that, I am joined by Dr. Arvind Panagariya, Professor of Economics, and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at the Columbia University. And also, many of you would know him as the first Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog from January 2015 to August 2017. Dr. Panagariya, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Govind. Thanks for having me. So, first of all, I think we need to change the optics a bit. That, if we truly want to be an export-oriented economy, then there has to be signaling. There is, two things. One, signaling, and the other is, of course, substantive policy changes. So both are important. But I want to first say something about signaling. That and my example here, a good example here is South Korea in the early 1960s. President Park Chung-hee, who really led the Korean revolution, as I would say, in a way, President Park Chung-hee was to South Korea was what Lee Kuan Yew was to Singapore. Although it's less well known, I think we know a lot more about Lee Kuan Yew. Now, first thing Park Chung-hee did was, just take charge himself, created a committee which he chaired himself. And this was a committee which would meet, maybe every once in a month. And all export interests would come in there, his own ministries, the industry chambers, exporters themselves, some of the academics. And they say, well, okay, what do we need to do to capture the global markets? And every month they would review what progress has been happening, what bottlenecks are there, and how those bottlenecks ought to be removed. I think that sends a huge signal. And something like that we ought to do, even if it's not once a month, that may be too much, but at least once in every 3 months, let's say, if there is a review of that kind, where even progress is assessed by the Prime Minister's committee, I think that sends a huge signal. That having said, there is also issues of policy.
Right. So, many people would argue that even if you were to look at the last decade, a lot of industry which could have been here, including, for instance, garments, has left India, gone to countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and we've lost those opportunities even while they were within our grasp. So why would that change, or how can that change?
But so this is why I think signaling is very important, that, we stand for globalization, we stand for exports, and we are not afraid to import. You see, when we also simultaneously say that we are going to do import substitution, which is what we have been saying and doing really, then the signal gets mixed up that, India wants to come to the global market as exporter, but it's not there as an importer. And that just, policy-wise also it doesn't help. So that's the first thing, the signal has to be very clear. And I think our signals have still been very mixed, in addition to the policy barriers that we face, to which we can come. But that really is the first thing. And this is why, also policy-wise, I would say Vietnam, Bangladesh, they have done better than us in terms of labor markets, in terms of land markets, in terms of business friendliness, particularly in a sector that you just mentioned, apparel, which is where we in fact need to capture that market at the global level. Vietnam and Bangladesh have been ahead of us.
Right. So you've argued several times in your book, as well as more recently in an article published on July 22nd, that, we should avoid the import substitution trap. And you've also quoted, you've provided, in your book, you've provided the theory, but in your article, you've talked about why it's practically wrong. But it is a trap nevertheless. I think you in your book have talked about that we tend to sort of relapse into it because of bureaucratic thinking, because of history. And how do we break out of that?
No, I think that's where we have to be bold and understand the economics of globalization. And that is that we cannot be export powerhouse without also being open on the import side. Remember one thing, that you want to export only so that you can import more as well. Just imagine if you were not to import anything, why would you export? That would be like, taking products and dumping them in the harbor because you're not getting anything in return. So the whole idea behind exports is that so that you can import things that you don't produce at a low cost. That's the basic point. The reason we fall into import substitution is that the producers often drive the policy, the manufacturers, the industry associations, and so forth. And for the producers, it is a lot easier to see that here are a potential for 1 billion mobiles. Well, certainly we are buying. Indians are buying a few 100 million mobiles every year, and there is no risk for us. We can capture this market. All we need to do is keep the imports out. As long as imports are kept out, the market is there. There is no risk. We can all assemble the mobiles. Let's do that. And that sort of also seems very plausible to the government. What we do not realize is that in doing so, we are effectively, particularly when we do this through not policy reform, but through import protection, that is imposing tariff on the foreigners, then we are encouraging our less efficient producers to get into the market. And these are typically going to be not global size kind of manufacturers, typically, and then we have done that in the last 5-6 years. A lot of entry has happened of the domestic manufacturers of mobiles, but in the end, not one of them is going to become an export powerhouse. I see no prospect. It's only some of the larger ones, the multinationals who have entered, who in any case operate in the global market, who would potentially be exporters. So you see, and when we do this, when we move resources into the import competing products that otherwise we would be importing, well, we are taking them out of somewhere. And generally, this is the export industries. So what we are doing is taking resources out of the industries which is precisely where we are much more competitive and into the ones where we are not competitive.
So the example that you used of local mobile manufacturers not becoming competitive. So why does that happen, or why did that happen?
So now we go back to the policy issues. Why is it that from the beginning we were not actually mobile producers, manufacturers, and by now major exporters like China became? And that has to do, of course, with our overall policy regime. First of all, we started opening up from 1991. Our exports as a proportion of GDP were only 7% at the time, including goods and services. So we started, and we were very gradual to liberalize and so forth. So by the time the mobile revolution comes, now also the phone manufacturer and everything was in the public sector in India. The private entry started in the mid 1990s, but it really was not properly opened up till Prime Minister Vajpayee put in place the new telecom policy. But that telecom policy allowed the entry of the private players, but not for manufacturing. You see, so that revolution actually could happen because at the time we were open on imports of imports of mobiles. If we had not been open because we had signed an agreement on international technology agreement at the World Trade Organization, under which we said we will allow the technology products to enter at zero tariff, zero protection. And so these mobiles would come in. And if you look at that time in the usage of mobile in India, the way it expanded, that's a phenomenon. I mean, it's truly exemplary. But you see, we had not done our telephone production at the time was in small scale industries a reservation. We used to actually reserve a large number of products for exclusive manufacture by the small scale industry. Now, small scale industry never goes in there with the export market in mind. And so as far as manufacturing was concerned, at that time, there was no chance that we could compete globally. And with zero tariffs, of course, imports came in quickly, thankfully so, because we could get the mobile revolution. So that is where we were. Now small scale reservation is gone, but labor markets are still a huge problem.
Right. Okay. So, let's keep the mobile and the newer industries on the side for a moment. But if you were to go back to traditional industries, including garments, light engineering, including let's say the toasters and the ovens which China excelled in. Now, all of which also happened in recent time. So what is it that we can do today, if we could and if we can, to start afresh?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, it will be very clear that we want to be an open economy. So that signaling effect is very important. But policy-wise, first of all, labor markets are very inflexible in India. If you are a company of 100 workers or more, then effectively it's impossible to lay off any workers. And that sort of deters firms in industries like apparel from becoming very large. Because, then you have to deal with the labor issues and all. And it's not a matter of, it's not that entrepreneurs don't want to employ workers. Their whole purpose is to employ workers, not to fire them. But, sometimes there are workers who vitiate the environment. And in such circumstances, you need to be able to lay off those workers, take them out. So that the firm can, the enterprise can operate properly.
That's a critical component of, amongst the reasons why we are not able to move ahead in light engineering.
Yes. No, in my judgment, it is, a lot of people can contest that. But I'm quite willing, so I'm eclectic in this matter. If others think that there are other barriers which removal of which will lead to these outcomes, I'm quite happy to listen to that as well. And I don't believe in one single reform, and one single reform is not going to do it, but it is one of the critical ones. But also, I think for our large enterprises, the land markets have become incredibly inflexible, and land is very expensive today.
Right. So if you were to now, let's say, start on a clean slate in some ways, how would we do it? I mean, what would give, and also let's keep policy aside for a moment, what would give entrepreneurs the confidence, particularly in industries where you genuinely feel you've lost the boat because, missed the boat? Because, if you look at China, I looked at your book, you say China exports $186 billion of clothes, almost $782 billion of electronics and electricals, and this is 2014. Obviously, all these figures are much higher now, over $1 trillion. So, where do we start, and even if we start, do we stand a chance?
Yeah, no, you never miss the boat. Boat is always there, and it's a matter of whether we get onto it. In fact, now China is getting off the boat in many products. Right. And we are the natural ones. Who has got the 500 million strong workforce? Only in India. Nobody comes close. I personally think that it's purely a matter of policy, and the sooner we begin to give proper signals while also changing policies. But I have one suggestion which I have written in the book as well. That look, my model that I'm very influenced by is the Shenzhen model of China. Take 2 or 3 coastal areas where, you got deep dredged ports, you got them in Gujarat, you got them in Maharashtra, you got them in Andhra, you got them in Orissa, and somewhere near there. Take out a land area which is at least 300 kilometers, ideally at least 500 kilometers, square kilometers, Declare that as an autonomous employment zone. And as in Shenzhen, empower the local administration to change the labor laws, to change the land laws, at least within that particular zone. Introduce that kind of flexibility. Also allow easy movement of imports and imports into the zone and exports out of the zone. So facilitate trade as well. I don't require any export subsidies or any export requirements. If they want to sell domestically, that's fine. If they want to sell abroad, that's fine. But fix your domestic laws nicely in 3 or 4 of those zones.
Right, but we've tried that in a way, and it hasn't quite worked.
You see, because the model has always been wrong. What we have tried are the special economic zones. And these are small little operations, which actually many of them became land grabs. Yes. And you see, this whole, the whole approach that we take that, every state has got to have a special economic zone. So I remember at NITI Aayog once, even the proposals coming in that, in such and such area, special economic zones are supposed to be 10,000 acres, but small states can't have it. So let's make it, 1,000 acres. But that's not the way. You see, it's not a matter of every state having this, everything. Industry locates itself in a few states, and then the workers move in. Shenzhen, when they started, had a population, those are fishing villages. There's a bunch of fishing villages, had a population of just 300,000, 3 lakhs. Today, you got 12, 13 million. So workers have moved in. And, the local language is Cantonese. Everybody speaks Mandarin because most of them come from the rest of China. So people will move in, industry will move in, and once the signal goes out, then a lot of the industry that's moving out of China would come into these zones. And once that happens, we can then begin to showcase that both to the outside world and to the domestic constituencies that, look, this liberalization is a good thing. We can then extend it to the rest of the country.
Right. So, one of your premises for economic growth overall is that we should have a strong export-led economy, and which in turn means a strong manufacturing-led economy. So, I won't get into that discussion right now. But, you did use the example of South Korea and, how they, with focus, turned themselves into an export powerhouse. But in India, the argument would be that we are a large domestic economy. We have, 1.3 billion people, and we have enough to, sort of create for and produce for and sell to within the country.
That's a huge strength, and I don't dispute that. And we are also now a reasonable size economy with about, close to $3 trillion we are getting there. So it's a good size market. But, there is no comparison to the global market, number one. Global market is way bigger, your manufacturing alone would be multi-trillion. Your goods export market today in the global economy is about 17 trillion. So, we are at 3 trillion total, goods, services, agriculture, everything. So it still is a very large market. But that's not the only reason. The much more important reason to be out there in the global marketplace is that that's where the technological improvements happen. That's where the innovation happens. And if you're absent from there, then you would not learn those things. I like to use this analogy with cricket. Why do we have such fantastic cricket players, coming one after the other? You got Saurav Ganguly, you got Yuvraj Singh, you got Tendulkar, you got Virat Kohli, one after the other.
MS Dhoni, who's just retired.
MS Dhoni, who has just retired, yeah. So that's coming because we are playing test cricket of every kind. International cricket, we've been there on the forefront. Makes a big, huge difference because that's where your mettle is tested as well. You also learn from other players, but you also get tested there. You really have to work hard. It's like, we academics, whether we are operating in the marketplace here, which is global, or we are just operating within a small little country. If my peer group is, my local competitors only, I know I can be laid back and so forth. I'll do 1 article, 2 articles every year, and I'll still be a Raja, but I can't survive here. I'm judged here by what did I do in the last year. Whatever stock you created in your last 40 years, that's history. Nobody, we know that. What did you do in the last year? That's the standard by which we get judged. That's exactly what happens in the global marketplace. So it's very important. And then if you can get the global companies to come in They bring their capital, their management, their links to the world markets, their technology. What we supply is good workers. It's a perfect complementarity. I mean, Japanese, look at that. They got extra capital, but they haven't got enough workers there to work on that capital. Let that capital come into India. We have the workers, so capital, Japanese capital, Indian workers, Indian labor. They can kind of cooperate together.
Right. So last two questions. So the first, of course, is the India and China, but even before India and China, the US was always weaning off because post-Trump in terms of trade, because of which a lot of manufacturing left China or began to leave China, moved either to other parts of Southeast Asia or even moved back to America. Or Europe for that matter. So, and India currently has tensions on the border, and that's playing out. But essentially, what we do want to do is take advantage of that situation economically. What would be your prescription?
Okay, so I have said that for a long time I was very much for the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which included 16 Asian countries, India and China among those 16 countries. But I think post-Galwan, I've changed my mind. I don't think we can really trust China in the longer run. And therefore, we need to decouple. But I'm very much opposed to doing this decoupling by starting a trade war with China. Some of the things that go directly into security, like Huawei equipment or some of the things that directly impinge on security, fine. There we have got to take an action based on security considerations. But otherwise, we should move away from China gradually. And we can do that if we forge trade relationships with large number of other countries. Within Asia, we got Japan, we got South Korea, we got Australia, we got even ASEAN countries, number of ASEAN countries. So that's within Asia. But I would start actually with a free trade agreement with the European Union. That's a large market. I think we do not have serious conflict in forging a free trade agreement with the Europeans. Because they will not push hard on issues of labor standards, intellectual property, etc., which the United States will. Likewise, also on agriculture, Europeans don't have huge export interests. With the Americans, the export interests of American farmers will come in conflict with our own willingness to liberalize our agriculture market. So for that reason, I'll start with the European Union. We have to be bold. We have to be willing to open our market for automobiles, our market for spirits and so forth, which are export interests for the Europeans. But we have to be prepared for that. If we want to tomorrow export, $100 billion worth of apparel and footwear to the Europeans, then we have to be willing to open our own market for them as well. That will be the big one. I'll start with the United Kingdom is another good market where we can have a free trade agreement. Gradually, I think if we do those two even, and maybe Canada, Australia, if we do those, confidence will be built up. We'll be ready to then also forge similar agreement with the United States. So that should be our roadmap. And it also, in that process, allows us to liberalize our own. And that sends the signal that India really wants to be an open economy.
Right. Okay. Last question, Dr. Panagariya. So, suppose you were to, again, to go back to the clean slate question, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would like to see from a policy point of view, but also, bottom up? A lot of entrepreneurs today, for instance, want to start tech companies or something in the technology space. They may not want to start garments or they may not expand existing garment outfits, or the Tatas may not want to get into garments, a point that you've, I think, touched upon earlier in an earlier interview that I did with you. So where would we, what would be the 2 or 3 things we could do or should be done to ensure that we get this off the ground, both from a top end, which you've touched upon, but also equally from a bottom-up point of view?
Yes. So first of all, I would very much again pitch for the autonomous employment zones. I think if we do that, that sends out a huge signal. And that would also solve within those zones the policy problems, with respect to the labor and land laws and so forth. So that I think would be one very important thing. Second, I would also say that the first thing with which I started, that the Prime Minister has to give a very clear signal by bringing in some of these labor-intensive product exporters. But also within that fold, we need to bring in the foreign manufacturers. I think, what has been missing very badly, especially in these labor-intensive sectors, are medium and large enterprises in general in India. I think, we are populated by very, very small enterprises, particularly in apparel, footwear, etc. These very small enterprises, you're talking like, 20 tailor shops with 20 tailors, that sort of thing. They're not your big exporters. There are 2 or 3 big manufacturers, and I think them we should consult. You got Shahi Exports, you got Arvind, and so forth. So there are 2 or 3 big ones. Consult them. What more needs to be done? So if the Prime Minister's kind of office takes that kind of initiative, that will send a huge, huge signal. Then I think states will follow, but some of the labor land reform states can do. I mean, Karnataka, for example, on land at least, has done very, very good, important reforms. They're trying to allow the conversion of land around the cities from agriculture to non-agricultural uses and so forth. And that, I think, is very, very important reform, because in the end, that's where the industry has to expand, on the periphery of the cities, that sort of thing. But these are things states will begin to do themselves if we do even these 2 things, autonomous employment zones and the Prime Minister really showing a very centralized, focused interest in exports of labor-intensive products by both domestic firms and by multinationals abroad.
Dr. Panagariya, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, insights, and sparing your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Great pleasure always to be with you.